Okay, well, welcome everyone who's joining currently. We'll give another 30 seconds and then I think we'll start. We've got quite a lot of people already join the call promptly on time. So thank you very much for that and welcome. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm just going to kick off. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session today. My name's Alex. I'm the Global Insights and Content Manager here at LGBT Great. And I'm delighted to be welcoming the Allianz Global Investors team and to be joined by Matt Cameron, the LGBT Great Managing Director, for the session today, where we'll be talking about the importance of pride in the US and EMEA. So firstly, I suppose I should say happy Pride to everyone, and a couple of housekeeping points just from me, and then I'll hand over to Marine for some opening words. The session today is being recorded and will be made available to everyone afterwards. And in the bottom of your screen, you should see the Q&A box and the comment box. Please feel free to use either or both throughout the session today. Please feel free to submit any anonymous questions you would like us to cover. We will be having a discussion at the end, so we can try and incorporate some of those points in. And also, please feel free to chat with each other and with the panelists as we go. Matt will be beavering away on the keyboard there, trying to answer some questions as they come in. So yeah, please do feel free to get engaged and to share your thoughts as we go. But that's kind of enough from me. I'll hand over to Marine for some opening words why we're here today. Oh, Marie, I'll just unmute you. There we go.
Is it? I think it's better if I'm not muted.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I was saying, yeah, hello everyone, and a warm welcome indeed from my side as well to today's session on the importance of pride, which we at Allianz Global Investors we have the pleasure to host, and which is going to be facilitated by Matt and Alex from LGBT Great. So for those who don't know LGBT Great, it's a membership organization with which we have also the pleasure to work, and which is specializing in developing LGBT plus diversity inclusion within the investment and saving industry. Also, for those who don't know me, my name is Marine Paliès, and Allianz Global Investors Inclusion and Diversity Leader. And maybe I'd like to start by saying first, huge thank you to all of you who have taken the time to be with us today. It's really great to see so many colleagues from Allianz Global Investors and also from other firms. To discuss this very important topic, which is LGBT plus inclusion. In terms of LGBT plus inclusion at Allianz Global Investors, maybe let me tell you that for us, pride is not just for pride, and pride is not just about the month of June, and this is not ending on June 30th. So we believe that LGBT plus inclusion is definitely a topic that needs to be addressed, all year long, that needs to be addressed, taking into consideration other diversity characteristics. So we often, focus on the G, but there is also, the L and the B. So that's very important to take into account. We also know that there are some minorities which are amongst the LGBT plus community more at risk of mental health. So we're trying to take all this into consideration when we are addressing the topic. In the past, we've been also trying to give some concrete tips in addition to awareness sessions like this one to our colleagues, and especially more recently we've been talking a lot about the importance of sharing gender pronouns and sharing them, for instance, in our email signature, not just in the month of June, but all along the year, to show, first of all, our understanding of the topic and our allyship, to non-binary people. So I'm glad to see that we are progressing and that more and more, colleagues are now sharing their pronouns, because that's a very important starting point, and we cannot, assume someone's identity just based on their physical appearance. And talking about that, this year for the very first time as well, we will be talking about transgender identity. So as in the past, we are running those sessions about exploring pride, exploring, what it means to be part of the LGBT plus community. But this year, we really wanted to do a focus on the T. I mean, talking about, gay inclusion, that's important, but talking about, gender identities and the media identities that are existing are also as important. So that's going to be part of our plan for this year, and I hope that this will help to elevate the understanding of all the challenges that LGBT plus and especially trans people are still facing today. So that's it for us at Allianz Global Investors. I'm now very much looking forward to starting this conversation. I hope that we will get lots of questions. So yeah, now without any further ado, Matt, I'm giving the floor to you.
Great. Thank you, Maureen. Great introduction remarks as always. I think one of the key points that really resonates with me actually from what you said is that Pride absolutely is not just for June, but actually Pride is all year long. And that's one of the things that I know a number of our members and certainly we at LGBT Great are focused on as well in terms of driving and keeping that energy and that momentum going. So I am going to be joined by Alex today, who's going to walk through some of the slide content, and we've got some really interesting insights for you. I'm going to be on hand to chat with Alex about what some of these insights mean, and also to sort of take any sort of questions and respond back to you on the chat function as well. So you would have noticed we've already got a little bit of a conversation started there. So what we really want to know from you today is, what does Pride mean to you? So what does Pride mean to you? And please do pop your thoughts in the chat function. And Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Maureen, as well, for those brilliant opening words. I completely agree with you. I mean, Matt, one of the things I've always said on these calls is, Pride is not just for Christmas, like that advert with the dog from back in the day. And I really do believe that Pride is for everyone, and it is something that happens all the time, just like allyship. Allyship is not just a one-time action, nor is it a one-time commitment. It's a lifelong commitment to positive action and to supporting others to experience that as well. So today I've got a series of slides that I'd like to walk you through. There's some thoughts from my side around what Pride means to us at LGBT Great, and then looking just around the world. What are some of the key milestone dates in the evolution of the Pride movement, in the US, but also across EMEA. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about LGBT inclusive language and allyship, and just share a few high-level thoughts, which hopefully we can then explore in a bit more detail during the discussion. So yeah, another call to action from me. Please do feel free to pop any questions as we go in the chat function, and I'll try and keep abreast of them. But Matt, please do jump in and shout at any questions that come through. And I've got just put on here a few objectives today, just around the origins and history of the Pride movement, the importance of Pride around the world, and again, this idea of navigating language and allyship. So these are some of the key themes from today, which I think are not just relevant for this Pride, but for kind of Pride every year, all year round. Just a quick plug on some of the work that we've done together with Allianz. So we've done some strategy and goal setting, we've done some role modeling programs, we've done reports and leadership and thought leadership programs, as well as we've been really impressed by the sophisticated and level and maturity of the I&D vision that Allianz Marine, that your team has. So, we're really impressed with the scale of this, and delighted to be with you today to talk about all things Pride. By way of an introduction, though, into today's session, what I wanted to do was just reflect briefly on when we talk about LGBT plus identities, what do we actually mean? And I think, some people on the call, I'm sure will think, oh, I don't know how to navigate this conversation even in the first instance. I don't know how to kind of start. And so, I think when we think of LGBT plus identities, there are four things that we should be mindful of. The first is gender identity, so the identity that someone has. So I'm identify as a cisgender man, which means that my gender identity aligns with the sex I was assigned at birth. So the sex is kind of the third pillar. So as you know, even here we immediately see that LGBT plus identities, gender identities are complex in that gender identity and biological sex are distinct categories. Okay, and then the second and fourth points around attraction and expression are the first is assigned, you know, what we think of when we think of sexuality, and then expression is how we express our identities to the world. Is that through clothes, which of course have no gender but are often gendered, the way we dress, the way we carry ourselves, the words we use, etc. So when we think about an LGBT plus person, although we're not being reductive, there are ways that we can, in a nuanced fashion, discuss that identity. So for a trans person, we would talk about their gender identity, is obviously distinct from their biological sex, you know, that they were assigned at birth. So I think when we talk about these LGBT plus identities, we have to be mindful of the nuance and complexity of them. And I think, you know, when we think about Pride, we have to go back to the US really in the first instance when we talk about the evolution of the Pride movement. I'm sure many of you on the call today will be familiar with Stonewall, which is seen as the catalyst for the discussion around Pride. And I agree that it was a pivotal moment in the evolution of the Pride movement and of LGBT history. But there are a few interesting dates that I wanted to also share with you. The first is that the earliest recorded pro-gay human rights organization in the US was actually founded in 1924, perhaps a bit earlier than some of you may have expected. And the reason that Stonewall was this, you know, pivotal moment for the voices of LGBT people was not because it was the first time that something like this had ever happened, because it wasn't. It was actually, you know, the latest in a string of confrontations between police and between LGBT people that had been gathering momentum and had been gathering, I suppose, charge throughout the 50s and 40s. So, you know, between the 20s and the 60s, we have this increasing conversation around LGBT identities, around LGBT plus inequalities. And Stonewall was the moment when LGBT people and police clashed in New York. And this then sparked a multi-day demonstration, which would then evolve into what we now know as the Pride movement. And Matt, what are your thoughts on, you know, some of this early history and the kind of pivotal dates in the evolution of the Pride movement?
Yeah, I think like you, many people view Stonewall 1969, the uprising, as really the start, if you like, or the ignition of the global Pride movement. And I think to a certain extent that is, you know, that's true, is correct. It really did shine a light. It was a little bit like the Black Lives Matter movement a few years ago, and I think the reason that time was so important, and there was so much passion. Really, when we look at these sort of social justice movements, there are always a number of trigger points, pressure points, leading up to the movement taking place. And we know that within sort of New York, that there were at the time a lot of discrimination, a lot of persecution. There were lots of moments where LGBT people were humiliated, you know, based on their sexual orientation, gender identity. Entrapment was another common theme as well with the police at the time. So we know that there's a lot of this playing out. This tends to be the most sort of publicized story, if you like, around Stonewall. But it's also true, and I think a key point to make today is that, you know, LGBT plus people have existed for as long as people have existed. So of course there are more histories before you know, the sort of the Stonewall movement. So yes, absolutely. I think we've got to look at Stonewall as a pivotal moment in our shared LGBT plus histories. But actually, I think we also need to sort of lift the bonnet up a little bit before then as well, to really understand how, you know, the pressure points and the time period built up to that rising in sort of 1969.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. And I think it's worth remembering that at its core, Pride is a political statement. It's a moment of advocacy, and I think now more than ever we must remember that, given what we're seeing in the US with the rise of anti-trans legislation that's trying to be brought forward, and the recent conversations in the UK around conversion therapy not being extended, the ban not being extended to include trans people. I think now this reminder of the importance of Pride all year round, as Maureen mentioned in the beginning, but as a political statement, as a moment of activism, as this idea, of a collective call to action, is still so critical now, just as it was in 1969. Of course, we've come on leaps and bounds since then, but I think it's definitely the case that it's still critical, although it's obviously expanded to be so much more than that. And I suppose one question that comes through is around this, how are corporates responding to this? And Matt, what are your thoughts on how corporates are responding to some of this LGBT plus sentiment in the US and around the world at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think it's a fact. We're seeing more anti-LGBT sentiment in the US than we ever have before. I think it's very important to point out that at a federal level, so if you look at the Biden administration, we're actually seeing more advocacy and more support for LGBT plus people than we ever have before. We're seeing President Biden say things like, we're not going to do business with your country if you don't protect LGBT plus people. But of course, what we are seeing on the ground at an individual state level is a lot of anti-LGBT sentiment, particularly in the more Republican states across the US. And we're actually seeing a record number of anti-trans bills in particular, actually more than we've ever seen before. 2021 was the most deadliest year on record for trans people as well. So what we're seeing from corporates, particularly in the US, is a lot of very clear advocacy, a lot of very clear visibility. We're seeing corporates work together to influence at a sort of a governmental level, which is incredibly inspiring. But we are seeing more focus now on how we can really fully support, empower, and protect our trans and non-binary, and of course all members of the LGBT community, within sort of the workplace. So I think actually the anti-LGBT sentiment is really accelerating now the focus of businesses, and particularly the financial services sector in the States, around how we can work together, to make sure that we are protecting those people most at risk.
Absolutely. And I think, another reason why Pride is so important, because it is a moment to reflect and push that conversation further.
Absolutely.
So yeah, no, completely agree with you on that. In terms of kind of Pride around the world, I just wanted to reflect on a few key dates that stood out to me in some of this, and from in terms of protections and equality for LGBT plus people, we can obviously appreciate that there is a huge disparity in the maturity of these protections globally, and it's hard to compare different regions. But what I wanted to do here was just to show some dates that were of interest potentially. If we take the the US first of all, one thing I thought was particularly interesting this Pride is that where passports are to have a non-binary option for the first time ever. So whilst simultaneously we talk about the rise in anti-trans bills and legislation that's trying to be brought forth through the court system, at the same time there is also recognition of non-binary people in passports. So there's a real disparity at the moment between where we are and at a federal level in the States and where we are at a state level. I suppose if we move to the EU, and I think there are a couple of really key things. 2021 was when the EU enshrined this idea of a freedom zone for LGBT plus people. So offering the kind of region-wide protections and against discrimination, really critical. And then of course 13 countries have currently legalized same-sex marriage. When we go beyond the kind of Western Eurocentric perspective, which obviously is something that happens, we fall into that because it's something that, we're based in London. It happens quite often when we have these types of conversations. But I wanted to just highlight a few interesting dates from around the world. So looking at Middle East and North Africa, and then Sub-Saharan Africa as well. So Israel in the Middle East is probably, we think about Tel Aviv as being one of the most pro LGBT places in the Middle East, if not the biggest. The first Pride was in 1979, and it hosts the largest Pride in continental Asia as well, which I think is great. And then Lebanon had its first Pride in Beirut in 2017. So there are, although obviously there's still many places in the Middle East where it is illegal to be gay, and same-sex marriage is obviously not legal. And Israel Pride took place this weekend. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the conversation here is really, really interesting and really current. I saw a news article today that the largest Arabic language pro-LGBT kind of campaign was launched this weekend in Israel, and was to highlight, for Arabic speaking people and communities, that the LGBT people exist, and to reflect that early discussion around we're here, we're queer, which was one of the slogans in the US in the post Stonewall era that came to prominence of the actionist groups. And this sentiment is being reflected now in the Middle East with through Arabic, and I think that's very interesting, and an amazing evolution of that conversation, which is critical. If we move to Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, obviously 22 states have actually legalized same-sex relationships, which is great, and South Africa is probably the most progressive of those, having its first Pride in 1990, and then legalization of same-sex marriage in 2006. And there have been some really great conversations around LGBT people in Uganda as well, and despite significant crackdown by police, the Ugandan LGBT plus community has been very close to having its first Pride, and I'm hopeful that if not this year, then next year, or the year after, that they'll be able to have a formalized Pride in a safe manner. And so what I think I wanted to highlight here was, when we talk about the importance of Pride, we must be mindful that Pride is at a very different stage across the world. When the maturity of Pride movements and Pride marches is very different. The UK is celebrating 50 years of Pride this year, and Matt, we're hosting an in-person event in London on Pride, and that there's obviously then very different levels of celebration around the world for the member firms that we work with and the clients that we work with. So I think having this sense of Pride as being important across the world is so critical. Matt, anything to add from your side around that?
Yeah, I think just to re-emphasize that point around, people's experience of Pride, can be very different depending on whether, physically located in the world. Can be very different based on, what's the family background, what's the school background, what's the religious or beliefs background. All of these sort of intersections impact an LGBT plus person's experience. So I think we need to be quite open-minded that people's experience of Pride is very different. And of course, Pride is a great time, it's optimal timing to be signaling around the world, what Pride stands for, and which is why I think it's gathered such momentum as a movement globally, Alex.
Thank you. And I think, one thing we should say in this conversation around Pride and the language we use to describe it and to describe the people that, are taking part, the LGBT community, that this conversation is not always an easy one to navigate. LGBT identities, as I mentioned in the beginning, are nuanced and complex, just like all identities are. And the conversation around Pride can be challenging to navigate as a corporate, as a group, just because, some of these things are challenging to, the breadth of gender identity and the way that we describe it in English, with different pronouns, and then some of this language is not necessarily intuitive for some people, and so what I would say is, I would echo what Maureen said in the beginning, is that one small demonstration of allyship that every single person on this call today can do is to begin including, if you would like, your pronouns in your email signature or bio. And what this does is it sends a positive signal, an immediate, ostensible and clear positive signal to someone else that pronouns is a space that is safe to talk about. And if you're a trans person, a non-binary person, then having this small signal is critical in building a safe psychological space to express your identity in it, without holding anything back. And I think we often talk about this idea of bringing your full self to work, right? I'm sure many of you have heard that phrase before, but I would say that actually I don't think we should bring our whole selves to work. We should just be able to be our whole selves at work without this idea of having to bring yourself is one that I think we should try and counter by building a space where there's no need to have that conversation around bringing. You can just be. And I think when we talk a little bit about language and allyship later, I think having this sense of the nuanced and complexities of this, I think is good. And when we talk about language and we talk about the way language is evolving, we must acknowledge that that young people are talking in different ways, and there's generational differences. I'm sure you look around your office and you think, oh, well, I use language in a different way to my boss, etc. And one thing I wanted to get a sense is that, Generation Z is the most as divisive generation and diverse generation ever. And a recent poll in the US explored LGBT plus identities amongst Gen Z, and I wanted to get a sense of people on the call today, what you think the estimated number, percentage of LGBT plus people in Gen Z are. And I'm going to launch a poll now, if everyone would indulge me in completing this quick poll. It should have loaded. Thank you very much. People are coming through.
Yeah, got a lot of fast responses today, so thanks everyone. We've got an engaged group today, Alex, which is always
excellent.
Good.
Like to see.
Great, we've got lots of votes coming through. We've got about 56% of you that now voted, see a few more as well. So what percentage of Gen Z in the US identify as LGBT plus? And this was a recent research study actually that was published by an organization called Gallup based in the States. So do look them up if you are interested. It's a very interesting piece of research.
Great. I'll end that poll now. Thank you, everyone. And then I'll share the results. So once this comes through, you should see that actually everyone was spot on. It was that highest figure, 20.8% is the estimated percentage of Gen Z that identifies LGBT plus. And when we then consider that these are the leaders of tomorrow, these are the clients and partners and colleagues of tomorrow, we have to be mindful that the way that we talk to them, the way that we engage with them, the way that we market to them, and I think is all critical. And Matt, what does this mean, do you think, for organizations that this is the case?
Yeah, well, I think the first point is that it means organizations have to be able to be fully LGBT plus equal and inclusive. So we know now that LGBT plus equality for Generation Z, this group of people, is very, very important. And I'd actually also sort of throw in there as well that it's equally important for people who are LGBT versus non-LGBT. So we often talk about the power and the volume of the ally community as well. But I think it means a few other things. If you think about how are we reflecting our support for the community, how are we ensuring that actually whatever products and services, in the case of our industry, financial products and services, whether it's on the retail side or the institutional side, how are we really baking LGBT inclusion into our operations as an organization, our distribution of products and services, our engagement with IFAs, our engagement with investee companies, etc. So there's an interesting point that came on the chat function just now around how we can start building in stewardship with clients, for example. And just finally, I think it also means as well, unless financial services can really start to get this right overall, and I think there's been some excellent progress made by the way, but unless we can properly, authentically develop allyship inclusion for LGBT plus people, I think what it really means is that we're not going to be able to attract the right talent. You know, we're going to lose talent to other industry sectors potentially as well. So I think, you know, the stakes couldn't be higher.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that, Matt. Thank you. And I think when we're talking about language a little bit here, with the language that we use when we engage with our clients, when we engage with partners, when we engage with different generations is so critical. And, we're having this conversation today in business English, I suppose, but that's not always the case. And so the one thing I'll touch on in a minute is this idea of, things that we can all do in terms of creating safe spaces, in terms of creating, gender inclusive spaces. And what I wanted to do is just briefly touch on some of the things that are occurring around the world in terms of LGBT plus inclusivity from a linguistic perspective. And I won't go through this in lots of detail, but I think when we think of language, obviously there are different languages where gender is ingrained in grammatically in very fixed ways. When we think of French, we think of German in the EU, and in both cases there is a push to incorporating gender inclusivity in a space that doesn't typically allow for it grammatically. And I think this is a really interesting conversation, this Pride, to have with people that are around you, is how are we being inclusive of people who may be non-binary or transgender, for example. And so, for example, you may have heard the Latin X, so the use of a gender inclusive marker grammatically, and this is being incorporated in German with the asterisk, and in French as well with the dot, combining both endings. And this is something that I think is still fairly divisive. It's still very controversial, but in many cases it probably is controversial to have this conversation in languages that have such ingrained gender in their grammar or in their structures. So I think, trying to break down some of these barriers around having a conversation around gender inclusive language in a space that doesn't normally allow it is something that we should probably try and do more during Pride Month, because it's so critical and sends such an important message. If we look further afield, if we look at Japanese, if we look at Chinese and Arabic, the same is true, that there's a spectrum of gender in many cases, and there are different workarounds grammatically, new terms, the adoption of foreign terms, etc., to try and to create a more inclusive environment. And I think when we think of safe spaces and psychological safe spaces for LGBT plus people, language is the first place that this is expressed. So just a couple of thoughts from my side around the language we use this Pride. But in a concrete way, though, what can we actually do as teams, as organizations, to create more of these linguistic safe spaces, these psychologically safe spaces for LGBT plus people this Pride? And there are 5 things here that I've just highlighted as things that you could consider. There are obviously more things we can do. The first is creating what we call safe spaces, right? Which is probably a term that many of you heard before, and can be a term that could be easily dismissed as, oh, well, let's create a safe space, this is too PC, etc., etc. But actually, when we talk about safe spaces, what we're doing is we are normalizing the conversation, and we are giving space, literal space in some cases, but opportunities for others to speak. We're creating spaces that are not fueled by unconscious biases, that are open, and spaces a bit like this, really, where we're having conversations about things, and you can ask any question you like, and it will be sensitively taken, and there won't be too many assumptions that are made. One thing that can always help is to try, where possible, to use more gender neutral and gender inclusive terminology. One key thing, one easy way to do this is, instead of saying ladies and gentlemen, to say everyone or folks, to use partner or spouse rather than husband or wife, boyfriend or girlfriend, etc. What this does, it just takes away that assumption of sexuality or gender identity. And this can send a really strong and powerful signal when it's used. I'm not saying that we have to, completely go away from gendered terminology and gendered language, because in many cases that's impossible to do, especially if you speak Italian, then you have to use gendered language when you use the past tense, for example. So, what it does mean, though, is if you're trans, for example, you have to consistently and constantly come out if you have to use gendered language all the time. So creating a space where you can have these conversations means that you can overcome some of those points of stress that may be experienced by LGBT plus people in the community. Normalization in terms of pronouns is a really good way of doing this and signaling this. If you were ever unsure about why this is important, if you think, if you're driving in a car and on the car in front you see a sticker of a cause you identify with, or a political party you support, or even just a rainbow flag, what that does is it immediately sends a signal that you could have a conversation with that person about that topic, and that it creates something that is safe. And having I was speaking to one client and they said that people had rainbow flags that they just had on their desks. And that is something, if you are a grad or a new person joining an organization and you see a sea of rainbow flags when you go there, what that does is it would signal positively that this is a space that I can inhabit and I can contribute to and I can, speak in. And so those small gestures, those small signals are really, really critical. Matt, what are your thoughts on just this, this idea of signaling and amplification, etc.?
Yeah, well, I think I shared this with you before, but when I started my career in this industry, actually the visibility of anything LGBT plus was completely nil. And I can remember, a few years later when I actually saw, a signal of support for LGBT, and the kind of feeling that I had at the time, it was almost like that feeling that you have when you come out of that last exam, right? And you just feel that sort of sense of relief and actually, there's something here that I can identify with. And it's that feeling, I think. If you think about, having a long period of time when you don't see, or you're unsure about whether other people around you are supportive, and particularly in some more, traditional cultures, and some organizations that I work with historically, are headquartered in countries where actually being gay or LGBT was illegal. So it was a huge no-no. So I always used to feel like I was treading on eggshells, and that is not a good feeling, right? When you're at work and you're experiencing that all the time. And I think the other point that I'd add to it as well, Alex, is that it's got to be more than just virtue signaling, right?
Yeah.
It needs to be more than just performative. It needs to be authentic. And that's one of the reasons actually why I've really enjoyed getting to know the folks at Allianz Global Investors, because the commitment from not just people on the ground, but leadership level, the most senior, even conversation with the CEO about dedicated commitment to really empowering LGBT people is so important. So I think making sure it's connected with that authenticity and that leadership and the culture, I think is also really important as well.
No, absolutely, and I think that leads on very nicely to I'll come back to the mistakes happen point, but I think you mentioned this idea of pride being something more than just performative, of signaling being more than just performative, that it has to be authentic. And I think one of the questions around allyship that we may talk about is this idea that you can't just signal things. You have to understand, you have to try and be informed, and to have the conversation and have difficult conversations with people about this, and to follow through. I think when we talk about pride, we should talk about how authentic it is to be an ally, how authentic it is to be part of the LGBT community, all these identities and these questions around language, and it's all based on humanity, and it's all based on authentic, real identity. So, allies, call to action don't just virtue signal, but you have to, work to be authentic So I think that's probably, I've waffled enough for everyone here, but I'd like to bring the wonderful team from Allianz Global Investors back online, if that's okay. So joining us in the conversation now will be with John Bolton, Marine, and then Daniel as well. So if I could, Matt, how should we tackle this? Where should we start, do you think?
Well, I think we should dive in perhaps to the first question and get the panel's views actually on why Pride is important to them. And though each one has got a different connection to Pride, but I think that's a really good way to start. So panelists, if you could switch your cameras on and reveal yourself, that would be great. But here they are, wonderful folks from Allianz Global Investors. And then over to you, Alex, to facilitate the combo.
Yeah, I suppose who wants to kick off, really? I mean, reflecting on some of that idea about pride is not just for pride. Maybe we could start there if someone wants to come in on how do we keep pride moving all year round.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I'm happy to start. Hi, everyone, and happy Pride, and thanks so much for joining us. It's been a great discussion already. I'd say that Pride for me is first and foremost a time of celebration, really celebrate how far we've come, the progress we've made, the advances that we've made in terms of LGBT equality and inclusion. It's funny, I have two wedding anniversaries, one of which is in June. And the reason, of course, that I have two is that I couldn't get married in 2010 and therefore had in the UK, and therefore had a civil partnership in 2010, and which we, Steve and I, my husband, we upgraded to marriage in 2016, because from 2014 in the UK, you could get married as a same-sex couple. Obviously, that's means I have two anniversary dates to remember, which is tricky sometimes. But it's just an example of how far we've come in quite a short period. Someone was saying to me the other day they couldn't believe that we couldn't get married in 2010. And actually, when you look at some of those dates, those important dates in terms of LGBT history that Alex ran through, some of they're pretty recent. They're recent history, and obviously we're very lucky in places like the US and UK to have some of the freedoms that we do, and we know that progress is at different stages in other parts of the world. But I do think it's the time, it's the month to celebrate those successes, but equally to know that there is still work to be done. Progress differs in different places. The type of progress that needs to be made is a different dimension in different places, but there still needs to be. We need to continue to make advances. And in fact, the progress that we have made, I feel, does need to be kind of shored up every day, year round, because we know that there is some sort of threats out there that are eroding some of the progress that we've made. So we can't relax. We have to kind of reiterate and rebuild, but celebrate first and foremost.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And this idea of how recent some of this is. I mean, if we look at the US, trans people only had their civil protections or civil rights protected formally and explicitly in 2020. That is so recent, and or that we've professed to be mature in how far we've come in from an LGBT plus inclusivity and from a safeguarding perspective. But it is really is yesterday. It is now. The conversation is still happening now, where I think that's why Pride for me, as you mentioned, is relevant all year round, because the conversation doesn't stop just because we move into July. Daniel, I'd like to come to you, if that's okay, just to get a sense from you around, what does pride mean to you?
Yes, hi, I'm Daniel Lehmann, and very nice to be here. Actually, when you presented as a timeline, Alex, you made me think, I don't know since when the term pride is used, but I mean, nowadays, it's really something which comes very naturally. But I think we cannot overestimate the courage that people had, I don't know, 50 years ago, right, to do what they did, and who enabled actually us being here now. So for me, it's an incredibly positive term. It's an incredibly positive time, something that unites in a time where there's a lot of kind of hate and polarization in the society. For me personally, it means to show my support as an LGBT plus ally and encourage others to do the same. So the little anecdote I would like to share, my personal experience, is like probably most allies who grew up in kind of European or even American societies, I took it for granted. I didn't think it is a thing, right? Being LGBT plus or not, because it didn't matter to me whether the person I talked to, how this person identifies. And I was rather a passive supporter, I would say. And the event that changed my mind was really when I moved to Asia Pacific, to Hong Kong. And I told the story before, and I'm going to be very, very short and quick. But what I witnessed was that the statues of HSBC, I can say it, right, the bank, 2 lions, right, were covered in rainbow colors. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, that's beautiful, that's nice, right? And it made me kind of cheer a little bit around that. But then the next day, I saw how this was perceived in the society, and I even looked it up because I found it now so hilarious now. So it was reported as disgusting, and that the pure presence of rainbow lions would threaten and trample family values, and that the rainbow color would deprive all the strength and stamina of the lions, and people were canceling their bank accounts. And I remember that so vividly because I was so shocked, right? How can a colorful statue kind of threaten someone and lead to such an intense reaction? And this was a moment where I realized for myself, oh no, it's not just something that you make up within yourself. It's actually something as a company, but also as a member of the society. I want to play an active part, right? I want to make a difference. And I just want to help make the society kind of more tolerant, right? And protect human rights, basically, right? And that was the beginning of the journey, where we then founded the Pride Network in Allianz GI as well, where I got in touch with Marine, and ever since, I think we have all had an incredible time together. And yeah, but let me stop here, and I think Marine surely also has something to share.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I remember this time when I came in your office in Hong Kong. So, I mean, I would also like to share some, let's say, hope messages from, I mean, the younger generation, because you said it very well. We keep pushing, we keep, raising awareness, educating people around us, and this includes, the little ones. So I mean, I'm lucky to have 3 lovely kids. One is 15, the other one is 12, and the little one is 4. And the reason why I'm talking about them is because recently in France, it was Mother's Day. And the 2, I mean, my 2 older kids used to come back, from school for Mother's Day with those, ugly pasta necklace and, stuff that you don't know what to do with, but you're so proud of your kids, making them that, you can just, you love them. And this year, so my little one is going to school for the first time this year, and nothing happened. And a friend of mine was like, "That's really weird. I mean, you didn't get anything." And my daughter was really, shocked, and she said, "Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't make sense to do something for, Mother's Day. I mean, what if, other kids, I mean, they have 2 fathers, why would they come back home with, a gift for Mother's Day? That doesn't make sense. And same for Father's Day. So we should either, get rid of those celebrations, or we should call them differently, like, gift for people that we love." And I was so proud because, I mean, I think that unconsciously, I'm also, spreading words and messages around me, and it works. So I can only encourage you, to do the same, and do not hesitate, to start having conversation with the younger ones. I mean, they get it very well. They understand everything. They are, I mean, more curious than you think, and they are the next generations. They are those who are going to make laws. They are those who are going to make, very important decisions. So they are very, I mean, important stakeholders, not to forget.
Thank you, everyone. I think there's some amazing points there that I'll just echo. I think, to stick on the younger generation, I have my siblings and who are, the early and mid-teens, are just the way that they talk about the people around them, the way that they talk about people at school, the way that they are so empathetic, they're so values driven, they're so willing to give space to others to hear about their identity, and whether that's because, you know, you could be cynical and say, is this because of the rise of social media? And, you know, and I think in a way it probably is a little bit of that, and this is probably because there are role models now in media that are accessible to people earlier, and when you think of, you know, I think of myself navigating my own, you know, sexuality, and you know, when I was younger, you know, positive role models were so important. You know, seeing someone on screen, or, you know, whatever, that was like that, what was like me, or I felt was like me, was so powerful. And I think the rise of LGBT inclusive media, of pro LGBT media and content creators is probably critical in forwarding that conversation and to having that conversation earlier, and it's probably goes to why, you know, so many people in Gen Z probably identify as LGBT plus, probably because they've been able to navigate that identity more successfully, and have those light bulb moments that make you think, oh, that's someone like me. I want to be like that, or I could be like that. I am like that. And so I think having those role models is so critical for young people, but then not just for young people, for us too, you know, as seeing leaders who are out, seeing leaders who are vocal allies, seeing leaders who are having conversations, tough conversations about these things, send signals. And we talked about virtue signaling earlier, but they send signals that do resonate, and that they send signals that are not performative, that they're real. And it's, you know, forwarding that conversation on. And Daniel, you know, you mentioned, you know, where did pride come from? Why do we call it pride? And Matt posted in the chat around, you know, the origin of the word pride, which, you know, has been linked to Tom Higgins, has also been linked to Brenda Howard, who was a kind of a really important bisexual and pansexual activist in the post Stonewall era. And, you know, her talking about it was that before Stonewall, before the rise of this conversation, being LGBT, being gay, being lesbian, because it was often couched in those terms early on, was something you weren't proud of, or you were told you shouldn't be proud of. It was something to be vilified. It was something to be demonized. It was something to be seen as being other. You know, we talk about the word queer in its fundamental term. You know, it meant something that wasn't the same. It was something different. And so the rise of the word pride is to reclaim this idea that being LGBT is something that's good, is something that's natural, and it's something that, you know, should be present. So yeah, thank you everyone for sharing on you know, what pride means to you. I'm conscious of time, and there's one area of this conversation I do want to talk about, and that's kind of effective allyship and authentic allyship, because that's so critical for organizations and for individuals. So, you know, maybe Marine, can I come to you just for some thoughts from your side on what does it mean to be an authentic and true ally during Pride?
For me, it means really, I mean, as someone was mentioning at the very beginning in the chat, you know, being intentional about the topic. So, you know, looking for more information, you know, asking questions, don't, you know, not assuming that you know everything. So it's and walking the talk. So, you know, it's being there for people who would need you, and to do that, I mean, showing allyship can be done through, as we were saying, I mean, sharing pronouns, but, you know, that may not be, let's say, easy, or something that can be easily done in many languages, but simply, you know, I mean, showing some signals, like I know Daniel has a very nice, you know, rainbow logo on his cupboard behind him. You know, that may sound like a detail, but, you know, he's spending time, you know, doing calls in his office, and people see this, you know. So Daniel is I mean, identified as, you know, someone who knows the topic, and you know, who you can come and talk about these, you know, topics as well. So it can be some small signals that you're sending to the others to say, hey, I'm here. If you need me, you know, I'm there. And it can also, you know, it can also be done through, if you observe or see someone, or, you know, not doing well, or, you know, asking questions, do not hesitate to also, you know, check with this person, you know, if everything is going well, if you can, you know, bring any additional support. You don't need necessarily to say the words, gay or, or LGBT, but you can find your own way to, send the signal that if someone needs help, whatever the topic, I mean, you're open and you're there for that. So it's, I think it's about, sometimes very basic things that, are valid for LGBT plus, colleagues, but also colleagues, who may feel excluded for whatever reason. So this is quite, at the end of the day, quite universal. But yeah, it's about being genuinely, interested in others and showing it.
I would like to add maybe one thought, because sometimes our kind of Pride group is very, very vocal, right? And we have a lot of kind of communication, and sometimes even people ask me, so it's not all about LGBT plus, right? So what about all the other kind of dimensions of inclusion and diversity? And first of all, I mean, people can obviously be in favor and against many things, so it's not mutually exclusive, right? But second of all, I truly believe, right, it's actually not limited, as Marine said before, to LGBT plus matters. It's really creating an environment where everyone can be just their true self, right? And it really doesn't matter. And that's what I feel with many of kind of people who talk to me openly about it. They kind of struggle about kind of what is in their head when they talk about LGBT, right? Plus, and I always encourage to let go of that, right? And to really consider it as just it's actually a place where you really have fun to work, where you don't need to second guess every word that you're saying, right? Where you don't need to be afraid whether or not you're accepted. So I think it's a very inspiring environment, right? Where yeah, people get more comfortable then opening up to this topic.
Yeah, and especially if I may add to this question, Alex and Daniel, I think, I mean, as a straight person and maybe as an ING leader, I mean, I get quite often, the question, why do we need to talk about this in the workplace? It's such a personal topic, and I like to explain to people that, as a straight person, I mean, we have this privilege, at the coffee machine to talk about, our partners, our kids, I mean, in a very natural way, but we don't realize that, I mean, it's a way of, it's a natural coming out that we have the privilege to do without fear, on almost a daily basis, because we don't realize how often we talk about, our families at work. So, I mean, if we are not able to offer, to everyone the same safe opportunity to talk about, what they like, what they do during the weekend with their friends, with their families, with their partners, with their, children, I mean, then we are not an inclusive place. So that's where, talking about LGBT plus inclusion in the workplace makes sense, because we should be able to offer everyone the same opportunities.
Yeah, Marine, I'd come back to the point that Alex was making about representation and the role that visible role models and allies play in terms of really opening pathways to people who might not otherwise consider career in financial services or a career in football or whatever it is. I think really representation is so important. Allies play a huge role, but also I think, Pride this month is such an opportunity to celebrate representation and see those kind of role models. We've had obviously Jake Daniels recently, footballer, just really, and I know personally that you look up to people, you see people as a kind of representing a pathway where your life could go, and that is so important. And I think that's the thing to remember when as Daniel referenced, I think at the top of the call, about the politicization of some of those topics. But at the end of the day, this is about people wanting to live their best lives and fulfill their potential. And I think everything that we've talked about today is supporting that simple human need, and the LGBT plus community and all our great allies play such a great role in that.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. We're kind of 1 minute away from time, so I want to kind of wrap up the conversation. I feel like we could keep going about this, but I think, John, for me, you hit the nail on the head in that last statement there. Pride is about people. Pride is about humanity. It's a reminder that everyone's different. Everyone is complex, and that's okay. And we're talking about LGBT plus people here, but Daniel mentioned all the other dimensions of diversity that are out there. Everyone's we need to have more intersectional conversation about where the aspects of our identities, where they intersect, and the challenges, the privileges that come with that need to be discussed, because people in positions of power like we are, privileged positions, need to spotlight and help and shine a light on other people, and to give them space to educate us. So for me, I think the summary for me is that pride is about people, and that people deserve space to be themselves. I'm conscious I want to give Marine just one last word from yourself just on today. Or you're muted, Marine.
Sorry, I was saying I'll be quick, and again, I'd like to thank you everybody who took the time to attend this conversation. But maybe, if there are two words that I would like to use to really summarize, this 1 hour together, and it goes back to the importance and the definition of pride. I think that the Pride Month is really the time in the year where we can be even more intentional about LGBT plus inclusion. And as John so rightly said in his last comment, it's also the opportunity to inspire more people to feel proud about who they are, and don't be shy to be their true self. So that will be really my takeaway for today.
Intentional, yeah, I love that. Inspirational and human. I'd add human to it. And then I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everyone today for sharing your thoughts on the chat, and to the brilliant panelists, and to Matt for joining me in this conversation. Is one that I think we should have more often, and pride is for all year round, not just for Christmas. But yeah, so with that, I will say happy Pride to everyone. Thank you so much, and until next time.
Until next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Happy Pride.